Good morning. Good morning. Sorry I'm late. All right. I did bring my candy. Who had the list of who I owed?
She's right there, but I could guarantee you I was
I know you owe me.
Okay. I know you guys wouldn't forget. Okay. Gee, it's hot out there. All right, cool. Right. So, everybody remember who they were supposed to be? You said you was one of those, right?
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you.
Who was the record keeper?
She's right there in the front. Live is here.
Oh, okay. Pick two.
Okay.
Let me help you.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh boy, this is the journey. I think I want to
Okay. Who else was? Any of you ladies? No? At least you're honest. All right. Right. Well, good morning. For those who were not here last week, I'm Shasta Trico-Moxie. I'm at least your lecturer for today. I don't know who's next week, but I'm for today. Some of you I had last week. For those who were not here last week, could you introduce yourself and tell me where you're from? Don't be scared. We don't
Dana
need.
Miller, compliance.
Okay.
Zenobia Ferguson, stay-at-home mom,
That's cool. All right.
former biker.
Okay. Right.
Cindy Young, never
Okay. That's cool too. Right. Okay. Awesome. So, why did I do that? Because compliance obviously covers a lot of areas, doesn't it? Compliance has now gone into every field, every type of business and industry that you could think of. So let's recap from last week. Last week I did the unit on terrorist financing, correct? All right. So for those who don't hear, I do like to pick on people. I will ask you questions, which I hope you can answer. I do have treats. That's my reward if you get the question right. And it's to encourage you to speak up. Cool? All right, so just recap on last week. So we talked about terrorist financing and proliferation. Proliferation is just a big word for really weapons of mass destruction, right? And so why is that really important? Because everybody wants to blow up the world, correct? So we just saw bombing yesterday, correct? New Zealand, a whole mosque. So there again, there's going to be, it was a shooting? Sorry, okay. And hey, you always keep it up. Somebody was listening to the news. All right, so, but here it is. What was it? It was a terrorist attack, wasn't it? So there'll be some investigations. You could bet that the FIU and the other police departments, special crimes units, are all going to be looking at how did this rogue, right, get the money to do what they wanted to do, correct? And so we're looking at how can we do this. We can do this through any kind of industry. We just need to move the funds. Remember, now terrorist financing can be achieved through legitimate and illegitimate means. Give me a form of legitimate means at which terrorists use businesses, industries. Charities is one of those, right? Pardon? True, one in a way. They can put a business together and say that's your pay, right? Okay, give me an illegitimate use of, to get, sorry, my brain is not percolating as well as it should this morning. Give me a means at which they would use that isn't part of the legitimate system. Drugs. Human trafficking. Kidnapping. Extortion. Yes. You guys are all paying attention? Right. So most places in the world, thanks to the UN, the OECD, and Financial Action Task Force all have some kind of act. It's called the Anti-Terrorism Act, right? Most of the provisions, remember, are the same. They're not going to be that much different. Why? Because everybody wants to be able to enforce, or at least get information if they can't enforce the crime against the individual in whatever jurisdiction they may be, correct? So really, they're kind of, it's the world's attempt to get everybody on the same page, so nobody could say, no, I'm not providing you with this information, or I'm not going to hand over the person, or I can't convict a person in my jurisdiction. So we know too that all of these legislations have some kind of extraterritorial reach. So in our legislation, as most legislations throughout the world that deal with money laundering and anti-terrorism, there's going to be some provision that talks about if the crime had not happened in that jurisdiction, but happened somewhere else, and amounted to what? A crime in your jurisdiction, and you can what? Prosecute them in your jurisdiction, right? So they're trying to make sure they're going to get these guys no matter what, all right? Because we've learned that terrorists really don't care who or where you're from. You're just collateral damage if you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the wrong place at the wrong time could be any kind of public building, any kind of aircraft, whatever, right? You're just collateral damage if you happen to get destroyed in the process, correct? So we also looked at means and how we could look to make sure that we're not being used to help these processes, right? So we looked at things like, one, places that you can, sites that you can look through, correct? Give me one that I told you guys about. So I told you get some sites you can look at to find out information, to make sure that whoever you're dealing with or. Okay, boy, I got everybody all on the ball today. We can start at the back and move forward.
Sugar rush.
Yeah, I watched it on YouTube.
Yes.
Obviously, I was thinking, actually remember that.
Yeah.
Okay, who else? Oh, I just. Okay, I can see you going on. Okay. All right. So yes, OFAC, one of the things that I wanted to, yeah, you guys can go back and see me if you wish on YouTube. I don't know if that's the greatest thing. That's why all these things are here, because for those people who sign in from like Freeport, and if you aren't here, you could go, or you want to recap, you can go and see it, the lecture. So I just want to pass this around. This is an example of the notifications I get, because I've gone onto the OFAC site, and anytime OFAC has some kind of new designation, they've changed the designation, maybe they are saying this person no longer is somebody that they consider a designated individual for sanctions purposes, right? They will send out a notice, and so it automatically comes to my inbox. Okay, so remember I told you guys about going to sites like OFAC, the United Nations. Anytime they post something, you'll get a warning. You just have to go in and actually click the right thing to say, notify me, right? OECD site is the same. The Financial Action Task Force site is also the same. If you want to keep up with what's happening, they're always there. Remember now, OFAC, the UN's, OFAC, not OFAC, OECD site, Financial Action Task Force site, Wolfberg group, right? That's the, remember our guy from the FIU here, Wolfberg, WOLFSBERG. Okay? So that's the group of financial intelligence units throughout the world, and they put out guidance and papers to help with things like PEPs. Pardon? Sorry, Egmont too. Sorry, I forget about Egmont. I'm mixing you all up, eh?
Yeah.
My fault. I told you I haven't had my coffee this morning. I grabbed it and ran. So it's Egmont Group. Egmont is the FIU. They all help you because they put out papers. Why do they put out papers? Let me give my guy here from FIU, because he's so nice to correct me. 2 is the mandatory amount you can take for my buy. Okay, so all of these sites, they try to help you by putting out guidelines, best practices, things to look out for. So it requires you, unfortunately, compliance requires you to constantly keep up to date with what's changing. Topologies, methodologies, all of these are constantly changing, right? So that's how we get to sanctions, right? I'm not going to go through the whole thing about terrorist financing. Remember now, our new act for terrorist, our Anti-Terrorism Act is 2008, 18. I told you, let me have my coffee. All right, 2018, June, no, it's not June. It's later in the year, but if you're looking for it in the Gazette, it's behind the, Travelers, I can't remember the act, but it's actually like wedged between something. So when you buy it, when you go to the government publication, you get like 3 acts in one, and it's the one in the middle. Okay? Read it, you will find that the offenses that are in our Anti-Terrorism Act correspond literally with the offenses in your book that the UK have. It will probably, if you go on and do some Google search, you will find that it also reflects other jurisdictions, almost the same thing. So they want to get people who are helping to arrange, conceal, attempt to conceal, transfer, all of those loving, keywords that always pop up. It's going to be almost the same. So I think I gave y'all some of the provisions, reflective provisions in our Anti-Terrorism Act 2018 to that of the UK. Anybody remembers those? If not, go back and look at the YouTube, right? I did actually give you a couple, right? But it's important that you also can look at our legislation and see how maybe it's slightly different from that of the UK, but relatively it's going to be the same, because everybody wants to achieve the same thing, right? Cool. So let's talk about sanctions. How do we get to the whole regime of sanctions? So the world's attempt to help to stop specific countries, individuals, organizations, companies that these individuals may own, right? To be able to transfer funds. If you don't have any financial asset to help you fund your activity, you can't do your activity, correct? Nope. So from 9/11 and other things like that, they realized if you cannot finance, you can't do it, correct? All right? Anybody remember how much I told you was used for 9/11? 37 millions, actually. 37 million. There was about 30 million was used to actually finance and carry out 9/11. Isn't that a staggering amount of money that went through the financial institutions and nobody detected it? Right? So the world realized if you can stop the flow of money, you can help to stop the carrying out of these acts, right? The same like if you can stop governments who want to build weapons of mass destruction, financially they don't have the money to get what they need, you can stop them in their tracks, correct? I don't know if that's helped Kim Jong, because he finds ways to get his money, correct? I don't know if Trump is helping the situation, but anyway, obviously, we know that there are going to be nations who want to be able to blow up the rest of the world. And that is to say, okay, let's use the U.S. Mr. U.S., you're not going to threaten me to do what you want because I have the weapons to back me up and I tell you no. And I have no problem just pressing the button. Right? And so that's how we knew that there's certain industries that are targeted for sanctions. Why? Because without the technology, without the ability to get the chemicals, without the technology, the materials, how are you going to achieve your goal? Right? So there are certain industries. So we talked about the UN. Let's go to sanctions now. We talked about the UN being able to actually being kind of international police, so to speak. Not technically, because they don't have maybe the full teeth that they need, but they're kind of not only the peace-driven global body that we all agreed to at the end of the Second World War, right? But they do have some sort of teeth. Remember I told you what the replacement of it was. Everybody remembers that? The UN replaced what? Mm-hmm. Who said that? All right. Minimum 2. Okay, so they replaced the League of Nations, and when we set up the UN, we wanted it to have some teeth. So most of the members will contribute persons from their military to help with the UN police. Now, to say that the UN police is still as effective as maybe one like the UK, the US, or one of these countries going in. Okay, so maybe they don't have the full backing, but they still are a deterrent in some way, correct? And one of the ways that the world realized that they can actually help to stop with the production of weapons of mass destruction and terrorist activities is through sanctions. Now, we know sanctions can be comprehensive, or they can be what? Targeted, correct. All right? We know also that for those who are signing up to the UN, they also, any resolution that the UN Security Council passes to set up sanctions must then be what in the domestic jurisdiction, put into legislation, correct? I showed you guys, I brought you a copy of one of the international obligation orders. I think the one I brought was the Afghan order, correct? Well, it wasn't Afghan. It only could be Afghan, Iran. I put it up. Y'all don't remember that? Don't sleep in during that part. Go back to the. Y'all go back to my YouTube. I had put it up. It was about this thick.
That's what you said to download.
Yes, I told you could download that stuff. You could download. You download the UN resolution, which technically all we do when we pass the legislation here, we attach the UN or resolution to the act. What it would usually have is a whole list of names, organizations, maybe, and it'll set out certain industries. So let's look at, if you look at the Iran order and the Iraq order, it specifically talks about, whilst it may not say that you cannot do business, what it says is, if you are doing business with somebody who's doing business in that jurisdiction, you need to understand what they're doing. So if they're involved in some kind of industry, so let me give you an example. The guy that's coming to open an account with you or maybe asking for your assistance to do something is in the IT business, some kind of computer business, technology. That technology, you now have to find out, could that technology be used to help to further a program of mass destruction, right? So that's what one of the things that the order actually says. It's not saying technically you can't do business with somebody who's doing business in Iran or Iraq or Afghan. You need to understand what it is that that person's business is all about. Remember, you have goods that can be used for one thing, but also can be used for something else. What do they call it? Yes, you guys are paying attention. Okay? They have dual purposes. So on the face of it, it just looks like it's an IT company. But that IT company could be producing the little chips that can help to power that weapon of mass destruction. Correct? So it's up to the rest of us, if we're doing business with persons like that, to understand, is that, a product that's being sold in our jurisdiction, that could then put us now in jeopardy where we get a knock on the door, we get an order, and it says, produce information on this person because they're involved in these activities. And unbeknownst to us, they're selling Pekin Jump, for example. Okay? Yes?
That's just an added question on you. Simply because if you're not versed in that industry, say for instance, if you're a banker
Mm-hmm.
and you're opening an account or whatever, or doing business with a person from that area, who claims to be, like you said, in the IT business, but you're a financier, you're kind of out of your depth because how do you actually investigate this person or the industry that they're in, when your knowledge is really surface?
Okay.
Because they could kind of talk right around you and
Sure.
it's kind of.
But guess what? Here's what the world says to you. Source of wealth, source of funds, right? Those are things that you have to know. And you have to have an understanding of what the person's background is. If you don't, then you need to go and find out. No longer can we say we didn't know,
I realize that.
okay? And they're going to be, you might open an account and it appears for all intents and purposes with the information that you did and all the steps that you take, reasonable steps that you take to find out what this person is doing. And maybe you didn't understand it because of how it was explained. One of the things I always tell the staff where I work is if you have a gut feeling that something isn't right, it usually isn't right. All right? If you have a question that doesn't sound, listen, everything in this world comes down to basics. There's going to be something that somebody explains something to you and you're going to think, doesn't sound right, or maybe I didn't quite get that. The onus is on you to ask the question. You cannot say you didn't ask the questions because you didn't know. Because what everyone else says and what the legislations out there say, from the Proceeds of Crime Act to the Anti-Terrorism Act and so on, is that if you don't know, you need to go find out. Okay? You see the problem?
Yeah, it is a big problem because now it kind of limits you, almost kind of fence you into, do I want to take that risk if I'm out of my depth?
Yes.
You know what, thanks for the business, but maybe you can go here.
Correct.
Because I'm out of my depth and I don't want to take on that inherent risk that may come with it.
Correct. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today, when you do your risk assessment, right, is what risk are you prepared to take? Correct? Based on knowledge of products, services, etc., that you are supplying. You're going to have to do an evaluation of your organization to determine whether or not you take that risk. Correct? So for all of those who, like me, have to deal with the central bank, I've already had to do an AML CFT risk assessment of my organization. I also had to do an enterprise risk assessment. That means to cover everything in my organization. All right? Now, we're going to talk about that a little later. Let's finish going through sanctions, make sure we understand. Okay? So we talked about sanctions being, they go after everything, and then they could be targeted. So, you guys, did y'all pass the sheet around, the email that I had? No? Yeah, pass it around. So, we talk about different things. So when we're dealing with sanctions, we know that we will have domestic sanctions. So we may have a body like the central bank, for example, that may set out certain domestic sanctions, right? We may have an international body like the UN that sets out international sanctions that we also have to deal with, right? We may have to deal with places like OFAC. Remember where OFAC? OFAC is the Office of Financial Asset Control out of the U.S. Treasury, right? We know that anytime we're dealing with U.S. dollars, we have to run checks through OFAC, right? Because what's going to happen? Yes, ma'am.
You run your employees through all that as well.
We run everybody through OFAC, okay?
Yeah.
Because, wait, you guys realize, remember what
Yeah.
you remember what I told you, right? we talked about if you're dealing in US dollars, it's going to go through New York, right? So anybody who's wiring funds, SWIFT is designed to do what? Run it through OFAC, right? And so whilst you may not be the institution that's wiring the funds, my friend Mr. Gomez back there may be the attorney that's on behalf of his client sending funds, right? My organization, we're pure trustees, right? We don't custody or deposit funds, but we have the accounts set up at the different financial institutions and we instruct them, right? If I don't know before I send that request out, the correspondent bank is going to come back to me, right? And that is the transaction is either going to be stopped or they're going to freeze all of the assets in the account, correct? So, whilst we may have domestic and international obligations in terms of sanction, we have to then develop policies and procedures to determine what are we going to cover. Are we just going to cover the domestics and we're not going to try and remember what the international ones are? The U.S. are really supposed to be specific to the U.S., but we know if we deal in U.S. dollars, everything is going through New York, and so guess what? OFAC comes into being. There's no way around it. We talked about, so one of the things you can do from that same site, U.S. Treasury site, you can actually go and do specific names, or you can download batch information that you can put on your system to run the names that OFAC has out there. Okay, so we know, for example, okay, we're dealing with the U.S., right? We know what their position is on Cuba. They may have relaxed it slightly, but they haven't actually taken down all of the sanctions, have they? And so we have to be aware of that. And we have to also be aware that in order to, the world says, okay, I may put a sanction on a particular country, but I'm not trying to cause all the people in there to starve to death because the government can't get funds to purchase goods and services to bring in. And usually there's whole embargoes, you can't send in import goods and stuff like that, right? But obviously the UN, because they know that still they're human beings in these jurisdictions and they will still need to be able to get fed, so they will allow certain things. Now some jurisdictions, in order to be able to necessarily send something to a company or designated persons, there has to be a license given. So they've given you the authority in a limited perspective to transfer funds, even though that person or entity may be on the sanctions list. Without the evidence to show that they've gotten the license, you're not going to be able to do it. Okay? So they talk about that in your unit. Correct? Oh. Okay? So there's some give and take with sanctions, but we need to be able to understand what happens. Most banks that get done in, right? Why did they get done in? Because they went to the U.S., right? And the U.S. has no problem in putting a penalty on the institution, right? BNP was one of the largest organizations to get sanctioned. In total, they got something like $9 billion of sanctions that they had to pay, penalties they had to pay for breaching sanctions rule. Can you imagine that? $19 billion. I guess what, they couldn't even blink because BNP got caught red-handed. It's in your books. Everybody, listen, there are two cases that will cover most of the things that you deal with in your units. In the BNP case, HSBC case. These are companies, HSBC. They broke every rule, all right? They didn't have proper checks in place. They didn't have checks in terms of, and policies on sanction. They outrightly put guidance within internally to help people avoid and break the rules in terms of sanctions. Yes. I see my girl has done her research. UBS, listen, I used to work for UBS, but listen, they got done in. And we talked about, remember I talked about extraterritorial, I don't know if y'all remember, the CEO that ended up where? He went to the US, and the US said, thank you very much for coming. We just help you with your stay. All right? So, we have to be mindful of all of these things. In the BMP cases, this brings up all sorts of things from other units that you have already done. So, they were actually telling people to leave what off of the SWIFTs? Okay, where's my bag gone? Somebody pass the bag over.
What did you say?
They were leaving the details off the SWIFT. So most of you should know that there's all kind of guidance as to the information that must be included on a SWIFT message. Okay? And it specifically relates to who's sending and who's receiving. Yes. Okay, my girl's on a roll back there.
Just give it a little. Right there.
All right? There are whole rules on this. And you have to build your policies and procedures around these things. All right? Nowadays, you're not going to send a SWIFT if all the fields can't be filled in. The corresponding bank is going to not even send it. You haven't sent all the information, guess what? That transaction is going to get held up. So BNP wouldn't have been able to do what they did today. All right? Now, the worst thing about BNP in most jurisdictions and most organizations will tell you, if you have any kind of subsidiary or branch in the U.S., for God's sakes, adhere to the rules. Why? Because the U.S. is going to get to you through those branches and subsidiaries. Once you have the presence in the U.S., they'll freeze everything to do with that subsidiary and branch. And they're going to get that branch. If you share computer systems and you can download the information that's in Switzerland, the Bahamas, or wherever, then as far as the U.S. is concerned, you better download the information. All right? And so, sanctions, when you're setting up policies, you see how all of this comes together. You have to be able to deal with all of the regulations to deal with wire transfers. All of the component information has to be in the SWIFT. BNP had actually set up, if you guys read the chapter, or the unit I should say, they actually had internal guidelines of how you could avoid it. And they actually got other people on board, subsidiaries and persons that they were dealing with, to agree with them. They must have been getting some real kickbacks to agree with BNP. That's all I could say. All right? Eventually you're going to get caught. You know, it's always a matter of time. I always tell people that. The rope is long. Somewhere it's going to come to an end. So obviously when we build in our policies and procedures and we're dealing with sanctions, we're dealing with anti-terrorism, when we're dealing with money laundering, we have to look at all of these international obligations, all of these guidance notes that are kindly put out by all sorts of bodies that are out there. In your books, they talk about papers that are put out by the UK. They talk about papers that are put out by New Zealand, for example, and Australia. These are all things, when I try to set up policies, I Google everything, because it's going to give me, thank the Lord for Google, because you could pull in stuff. Most stuff is public. All right? The only difficulty with public is the terrorists are looking at the same thing we're looking at. Right? And they're getting more sophisticated as time goes by. You know, we're always one step behind. We're not one step ahead, we're always one step behind. They have lots of time on their hands to figure out how to breach our systems and policies. Correct? So, joy with sanctions. Now, one of the things that our legislation now requires to do, y'all, I don't know how many of you guys remember, I said this, our legislation currently with the UN orders that have been put into our domestic legislation requires financial institutions to report annually, provide a certification that the persons on the sanctions list aren't persons within your institution, and if they are, you report it. Because some of us have already had to do it. I had to do it quite recently, and they didn't actually give us any kind of form of how we were supposed to make the certification. We just had to make it up. But if we didn't comply, guess what? Penalties. Get administrative penalties. Okay? That's one of the ways that our regulators get at us to ensure that we are complying with the legislation. More so now under our new Financial Transaction Reporting Act and regs, which came out in June of.
May 25th, 2018.
All right, we paying attention. Pass the bag up. All right. And remember, it isn't just the financial institutions is broad, right? So that's why I was happy we have such a wide variety of persons from different backgrounds and industries here, right? Because guess what? It's the non-designated financial institutions, professions, and yes, okay? So that's the real estate agents, the accountants, the lawyers, dealers, the cash for gold people, credit unions. We can keep going. I mean, the list just keeps going on. And they all now have the teeth that the regulator can impose administrative penalties and fines on your organization or yourself. You can go to jail too. If you don't adhere with these provisions. And that's one of the things that CFATF, when they evaluate us, requires that we make sure it's in our policies and procedures and it's covering every industry. One of the things everybody remembers when I talked about CFATF, our evaluation hasn't been the greatest. Why? It hasn't really been because technically financial institutions haven't been putting policies and procedures in place and really being the watchdogs. It's really two things. One, they felt that our regulators really didn't have the oversight that was needed. And two, one of the things that we never think about when CFATF evaluates us, they evaluate us on a national level. So they look at the fact that, well, the Bahamas is one of those places where we have all this islands, territory, water, and we're not able to cover the points of entry. Right? So that means drug trafficking, human trafficking, all kinds of things, breaches of the customs duties, all these things come into effect. Things are going on all the time, and really we don't have the ability to police it. And we don't have policies and procedures in place that could effectively do that. So they look at every industry. We know that they looked at the gaming industry in terms of the number houses, right? We saw how they became licensed, and they have to set up KYC policies and procedures. They have to also look at things that they could be used for terrorist financing. Could they not? Yes. So here again, you see how it all comes into play, right? So the units may be separate, but when you think to answer questions, hint, on your assignments, you have to look at the broader picture as well. Okay? So they're looking at you to see how holistic you are in your evaluation. That was just my summer hint there. I don't actually have your paper because somebody was supposed to send me some stuff. Did you?
I was supposed to say?
Yeah, the papers. I'll ask Ms. Dean. Usually she gives it to me so I can help you guys with your assessment. Hopefully the next person will have to do it because I think it's after.
It's on it right now.
Okay. It's after your next unit, I think, eh? Joyce. Your assessment that you have to put in. I don't know the topic. Don't you have one coming up? Yes, I know. It's April?
April 9th. April 8th.
Okay.
Put it in the night.
Yeah. So I don't really know what the question is.
We can tell you.
Oh, it's a question.
We'll just go down.
The last one that I dealt with was kind of like a whole story, and you had to take out. I was helping. This is where I was teaching on the GDPR, which is the UN's general data protection regs that everybody, the rest of the world, has to comply with. And so I looked at that question. So, yeah, all right. So they're covering most of the stuff that we covered here, and some other stuff. Say like D.
Okay, let's go over that specifically.
Okay, let's finish up to date, and I'll go over this.
Yay.
I see they have the U.S. Patriot Act here. We went through that last week briefly. Remember, I told you have to read up on it. Remember I said you don't have to read the Patriot Act, you have to understand it. It may be required that you have to read the specific sections, because the Patriot Act is like a Bible. All right, that thing is huge. All right,
It's so boring.
don't try to print it.
It looks like this.
It is, like I said, if you wanted to go to sleep, go and read it. Okay, it's sure to put you to sleep. But unfortunately, you have to be aware of the provisions of the U.S. Patriot Act. Remember, they deal with the specifics in your,
I think it's Title 3.
yes,
Yeah, Title 3.
it is. Okay? Okay, so you guys did some research. I'm so pleased. Hopefully some of you actually did check out Navigate Charities.
Not
No?
as yet.
Okay. All right, we'll go there. Like I said, there's so many things to help you to avoid the pitfalls. So be mindful of that. All right, so any questions that y'all had from last week? No? Nobody had no questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, you spoke about how the U.S. has access to the subsidiary, persons who have subsidiaries and branches under the U.S. So, what are some of the things that people do to avoid
They're trying not to
information?
set up
Subsidiaries in
in
the
the
U.S.
U.S. or branches. Okay.
Can you avoid it? Like, I mean, in most instances, or?
There are companies who don't have any kind of presence in the U.S. All right? You don't set up your account in a bank that you know has a presence in the U.S., right?
But if, okay, for instance, if you have but most people have U.S. correspondents.
Correct. That's how the U.S. gets you.
So you still have to kind of work around the fact that you have to have this information.
Listen, I try not to tell people work around because sooner or
Not
later,
work around, but I mean, have the procedures in place to
Yes.
deal with the U.S. correspondent.
you have to.
procedure.
Because remember, if you're dealing in U.S. dollars, the monies is going to go through New York. New York is the hub that deals with the movement of U.S. dollars. If you're dealing with U.S. dollars, it's going to go through a bank in New York. You will notice that most of the cases brought against institutions are brought out of the state of New York, are they not? They're not brought in California and these other places. They're brought out of New York.
So basically, regardless of whether you have a U.S. subsidiary or not, you are going to be,
Yes.
the information is still accessible in
Not necessarily.
a sense.
They're not as able to get the information then as easily.
As you,
But we have other things in place that can help them get that information, couldn't they?
right,
You know
like
what
a
they are?
Broadwood agreement.
Yes, agreements like tax and information exchange agreement, mutual legal assistance treaties. All of these things help other countries get the information that they need to prosecute and to find and seize funds, correct? And so in chapter 7, they talked about particularly banks that are utilizing, particularly in US dollars. Even we have UN lists, don't we? All right, it's going to be interesting how that works with the Brexit. The UK obviously is going to have to and they are in the process of relooking at some of the things that they had in place in terms of KYC, in terms of their regulators requiring licensed bodies to do certain things, because a lot of it was based on the UN requirements. So if you remember, I talked about the UN fifth directive on money laundering should become active when? The end of, yes, this year. All right? Pardon?
That's not something about the UK and USA have an agreement
They do.
on terrorism.
Okay, so I actually printed this. Okay, let me see where I have it. So if you go on the U.S. Treasury site, you'll find this. This is the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program. Now what it is, it's a database, right, that the U.S. had put into effect prior to 9/11. After 9/11, it gets information from all these different organizations like Interpol throughout the world to add information into the database. The UK and the US went into a specific agreement that you could also download and find on the site that talks about how they share the information to put in the because where's Interpol based? Right? In the UK. Yes, and so what they do is, and Interpol kind of gathers all of that information in from Europe and all over the world, because they're kind of international police, and they share that information, and the information is put in this database. This database is huge, and you'll find that the policing authorities throughout the world have access to. If they don't, they try to get access to so they can track things. It's a huge database. It has information. The amount of information it has on individuals in there is staggering. Okay? Now, does that mean the rest of the world can access it? Not really. Okay? Because obviously they're trying to stay one step ahead of the persons who are there, right? But it's important to note that a lot of jurisdictions have actually gone into an agreement with the U.S. to be able to utilize this. And if you actually go on the site, you can print out a quick kind of sheet that gives you, let's see, this is the one, yeah. So this is a fact and like a question and answer on different things that relates to it. It's obviously good to look through it. They refer to it specifically in your unit. I would suggest, it's a PDF, this is the size of it. It gives you a better synopsis of what it does as opposed to the unit. The unit that we're studying does, okay? I mean, get the information. It's always good if you know it and can use it. Particularly, I'm sure that they are requiring you to refer to this somewhere in your questions, somewhere.
Could I ask a question?
Mhm.
This being the compliance costs and all of these regulations, how was pretty against money laundering, but this money laundering really got commonplace in the real world.
Money laundering is quite commonplace in the real world. Happens all the time. Quite often, okay, let's use an example. Somebody can quite easily come into your office and say they want to buy real property, right? And they fund the real property from proceeds of crime, right? And you're then going to help the system, if you don't do certain things, understand where the money is coming from and originating from. How did they get it? You could be used quite innocently, yeah, to help to purchase, get the monies in the system. Really, they only want to get the money in the system, right? They can get the money in somehow. You know, we talked about, give me just a second, other ways that you can get monies into the system. You could transfer monies. We talked about non-traditional means of getting monies from one place to the next. Anybody remembers? Hawalas. Remember I talked about the NCIS episode that speaks specifically. I think they have 2 or 3 of them about it. But one in particular kind of really talks about and gives you detail People don't realize what they were watching, but really that's what it did. It helped you to understand what hawalas are. Remember, before we had a banking system, we had these non-traditional forms of banking out there. Some would say even our gaming houses are doing the same thing, aren't they? Because we talked about branches closing down in the out islands, and people don't have a means to get monies to their family. What are they gonna use? If you have an account with Island Luck or one of them, you can tell your family member, okay, I send you the money. I can put it to your account, right? RBC and the rest of these have closed down the branches in these out islands.
How when they stop like that? But it regulated them being able to transfer money to those islands at the time.
No, I think there's a limit. on
They
the
put a
amount.
limit.
Can't
On the
take
amount.
more than $50 So if someone sends you $200, it's gonna
Yeah, you
take
take
you
a
4
swi-
trips.
Yeah.
Is it $50 a day?
In theory,
But that's not really how.
all right? In theory. Now,
If you tip, I guess if they get tipped, they might probably.
we
give
know
you
that
the
there are
whole thing,
ways
but it's
around the
$60.
system, right? But obviously, what's supposed to happen is they fall under which regulatory body?
Gaming board, which
The
is.
gaming board is supposed to be doing inspections and other things to make sure that they're adhering to the policies and procedures that are out there. Remember, I talked about we have what we call the group of regulators now, right? So when you look at the guidelines to deal with money laundering, terrorist financing, you see all of the logos for each one of the regulators on there. And when you go to like the Securities Commission site, you will see that they refer you to that particular guidance, right? Because they're now issuing it together, and they're saying everybody has to adhere to it. All right? And so technically, the gaming houses are supposed to be inspected to see if they're actually adhering to the guidance notes, the policies, the legislation, and the rest of that that's out there. They put policies and procedures in place. Right?
Question. Do we have to get compliance officers from law firms now?
Yes.
Like, is it mandatory at every law?
It's been there for a while, but what happens is they
Real
now
estate too.
decided to give it a little bit more teeth by, through the new Financial Transaction Reporting Act, 2018.
How do lawyers actually verify where their clients get their money from?
So most attorneys, you go there, they have a little sheet that they make you fill out, and it's a KYC sheet. The question is, what, you don't know perhaps maybe what they should have behind the scenes to verify the information that they're asking you in that due diligence sheet. Correct? You go to a number house and you want to set up an account, what do they ask you to produce? Yeah, so they have their own policies and procedures in place as well, correct?
But I can consider the fact that these people bank with institutions as well,
No, see, my thing is, I know it's related to this. Okay, for example, a lawyer takes on a client that doesn't work, but is able to post $10,000
That's what I thought he was
retainer,
asking.
and they pay this into the company, the firm's bank account, which automatically launders it because they would have been presumed to do due diligence.
Yeah.
And so now, once that lawyer deposited firm to pay his employees, that's money that's been completely laundered as far as law is concerned.
Yes.
So what do they have in place to ensure that this isn't what's happening?
That's their KYC. They're required to adhere to set up policies and procedures. So they have to set out in writing how are they going to, what are their processes to make sure they know where the funds are coming from. They're not being used.
And then what, if they find out that maybe the funds are from a perceived crime, what they do afterwards?
Right, so
So,
escalation,
And-
they have to report as well to the FIU.
And not to accept a large retainer
Correct.
over a certain amount in cash.
Large cash
You know,
transactions.
so you mentioned $10,000, you may have a limit
that's just a
because,
random account.
yeah, but.
That was
Yeah,
a
but-
question
But
though.
I could go and I can put $2,500 down in cash, maybe, and it may not be a big question about it, but, a retainer of something more significant is coming from authorized bank, coming from a
Right,
bank, you see?
and so they would want to
So
make
that's
sure.
already cleared in the system, so to
No,
speak.
but I'm asking the question in particular for criminal attorneys who are people like they defending let's say, defendants who go in on trial for drug charges, like.
Okay, there's certain
let's say
things
the family
that, okay.
gave me my money here.
We know that if you're up on drug charges, right, the funds are probably gonna come from there. But the law also looks at the fact that you need to be represented, and so the attorney actually will have to be paid.
Right.
And more than likely, the proceeds are gonna come from there, okay?
That's actually interesting.
But that's
Okay.
there was a case in our court that I read in looking at question E for assignment where the judge here actually ordered money from laundered funds to pay attorney fees.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Tell us where you find that case,
It's
www.
not laundering.
Proceeds of crime.
It's proceeds of crime.
www.
Okay, hold up. Laundered let's just understand something. It's the proceeds of crime. That's really what you're looking for. And that's what happens. The funds are coming from the proceeds of crime.
Right.
Yeah,
Um,
the money's that the person stole.
Because even when there's proceeds of crime, remember that money has to go somewhere in the end. They don't take it and burn it in the trash.
They use it.
It's gonna go into the government treasury and so forth. You know, we just don't want you benefiting off of it.
Stolen,
You know.
right? Say, for instance,
Yes, if it
if it
was,
was stolen.
or
Mhm.
it was through fraud, it's gonna
Right.
go back to the
Then it goes
person
back
who was
to the bank.
defrauded.
Yes.
Correct.
Stolen from.
All right, but let me help make sure that you understand. Really what they're looking at is the proceeds. Where did the funds come from? All right? Yes, attorneys have to be, put these policies and procedures in place, right? Obviously, this has to be looked at in other areas of the law that says everybody's entitled to due process, they've been required to have representation. So you have to pay your attorney, correct? Okay?
Yes, but I don't know, I find that it's sloppy enough.
No,
Yeah,
because like
yeah,
when
yeah.
they.
Well, you have to balance, you have to create a balance. You have to create a balance,
But
okay?
Shasta, I don't know if I agree with what you just said. Because yes, I may have to represent this drug dealer, but now you have to you have to, as a lawyer and with the procedures, the policies, the laws that you have to follow, have to make sure you will be compensated legally.
Yes, which
So
is,
if drug dealer here says I need you to represent me, you then are like,
hold on,
okay,
too many
my
conversations, hold up.
if she needs you to represent her and her you can represent her, everyone's due their day in court, but it's now how do you get paid? You still have to do your due diligence because you do not want to be facilitating.
Okay.
So then she may say, oh, my friend Valentino's gonna pay my bill, and now you do due diligence on me and I'm a clean guy. You see?
True, but then too, you still are going to have to, more than likely, you have to get the funds from the person you're representing, all right? And so they want you to be able to say, this is where, good, listen, if somebody pulls up and they're giving you a retainer in cash for $10,000, you should be very concerned,
Very concerned.
okay?
Is it remedy?
Oh, jeez, sorry. Hold on just a minute, Tony.
And hey, Roger,
Hello.
to answer your question,
Trinity, I'm
when
teaching,
you
I'll
ask
call you
that
back.
money laundering is common.
Sorry, that's just my little
Reality is
person.
Most crimes.
Hold on now, see, okay, remember now. Sorry, you were saying something before.
Is it remedied by, for example, if the attorney completes a suspicious transaction
Yes.
before attendance filed,
It
does
is.
that
It is.
satisfy their requirement?
To an extent, because remember now, you have new provisions now. Remember, we have certain periods where you have to get consent, correct? Y'all remember the new procedure on consent and the moratorium period that's now in the act? Okay, y'all need to go back and read your legislation. You were the FIU? Wait now, hold up.
I remember reading, I can't remember the name at the time.
Okay, hold on. In your units, they talk about specifically with terrorist financing in the UK. So the UK has a lot of the same provisions that we do, right? With terrorist financing, that moratorium period is longer. Now, what do I mean by the moratorium period? Under our new act now, if you put in, say haven't done the transaction yet, and you put in a report to the FIU, that report could be verbal or it could be written. If it's verbal, you have so much period of time to put it in writing, right? And you then have a period of time. Anybody knows what that period of time is, where the FIU, once they receive your report, they can actually come back to you and say, you can't do anything. 7 days, correct. You want candy? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Guess what? Remember, it doesn't matter if the person is a lawyer.
And then they can extend it for up to 30 days or something.
They can extend it. So the moratorium period, the moratorium period is the 30 days after the 7 days has
Yes.
expired.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's right.
at the 7th day, if you haven't gotten anything from the FIU, they say you can go ahead with the transaction. However, if you got something from the FIU, say you cannot do the transaction, then the FIU has an additional 30 days to get whatever they need to from the courts to stop the transaction. If they don't, then you go ahead and you can go with the transaction. But bear in mind that then it's the obligation on the person who has to make the transfer or whatever to stall, because you can't tip off. So you can't say, oh, by the way, I made a report to the FIU, right?
Right.
So you're gonna have to stall. That's a long period of time. You understand?
Yeah.
Boy, you know how much custody you be getting?
Like to ask for further due diligence?
You could ask for further due diligence, but in your asking, you have to be careful.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're seen to have tipped off in any way, you can be charged, correct?
But tipping off itself is even, I would have had situations where the transaction from you see that the beneficiary, like,
I blame
just everything
everybody.
just
I blame
fireworks go
everybody.
off.
Listen here, I go into First Caribbean or whoever, and they need more information, and they're not gonna send this until you provide it to me.
Exactly.
I can blame everybody. I can stall, because y'all ain't, I already tell y'all.
Yeah.
I'm not going on the speeding bus, okay?
I give
That's
y'all,
probably, when you come back with all these things, this is what happened, am I being investigated?
You
But-
still can't
And you
answer.
don't say,
I
what else you
remember-
just needed?
Oh,
But
we
they
just
know.
need it.
But they kind of know from you can't process the transaction.
But
the money
you
just
still
sitting
can't
there.
be said to
Exactly.
overtly
I don't say
tip
it.
off, right? Because then you're in trouble.
I'll give y'all a 21. I was with a small institution in September of 2001. And shortly after September 11, maybe the next week, I don't know what day of the week September 11th was, but a client called, wanted to close his account and transfer all of his funds to London, somewhere in London. It's a small amount, as we know.
Bobby didn't tick off any boxes.
No, but hold on, the small amount. But what was alerting was the name it was going to.
Okay.
Some,
Abu Dhabi.
yeah, some Halawala type name, and immediately,
Some Mohammed
some immediately,
Okay.
and it's a very small institution, but immediately the powers that be all started getting in a hissy fit, like what, and then they was like, Valentino, you have to delay that.
It's gonna happen, and you're gonna have to be creative. I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to be creative.
And I'm this young, my God, this time really,
How do I
not
be
the
creative?
most experienced. And what was so funny, as I'm delaying this and saying, oh, this, that, but yeah, the guy says to me, the client says to me a few days in, Valentino, what's going on? Is it my name? I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, he ain't stupid. Like, is it my name? Like, yeah, I know September 11th. Because I'm like, does it have anything to do with my Muhammad, blah, blah, blah.
Unfortunately,
I don't,
So
I
understand.
don't know what you're referring to.
Remember now, one of the things the compliance officer has to be able to do when you're training, you have to train. We talk about, I'm not sure if you guys have done this yet, but you talk about how compliance officers train. I train everybody in my organization, from the messenger to the receptionist, wherever, I don't care. Everybody could be used, right? And they have to understand or be able to pick up the red flags that are out there. So your compliance officer has to help you, Your compliance program can't be such that it just tells you this is what you need to look out for and doesn't help you to get where, how do you tell the client, okay, how do you stall? You gotta figure out a way to stall.
Yeah, and I didn't
Well,
get no
they always
support.
try to say compliance thing. They do, but you're not really supposed to say compliance.
No.
But,
No.
they do. They do.
Further due
Diligence, we dealing in this world of de-risking and correspondent banking. If I can't say with this transaction, I'm sorry. So I need this from you because the correspondent bank isn't gonna send it. Brown, please send me my information. You're gonna have to work it out. I had a transaction got held up for about, I think it was 2 months. And we realized that the institution probably had gotten audited. And part of their internal audit, they kind of realized that they perhaps, it isn't the fact that they didn't ask us and we didn't have the information. They didn't do their due diligence. So they've already red flagged our accounts. All right? And instead of the person who was in their organization was told to ask us for certain things, they never did. So we kept trying to figure out what the heck is going on here, right? We know our clients are legit. We've been the trustee of them for years, all right? And here it is. We even set up the account with you. We moved it from one institution to another for tax reasons because their tax regime changed, right? But here it is. They didn't tell us. They held this thing up for 2 months. Of course, our clients are livid, aren't they? You understand? Luckily for us, because obviously you have to weigh this against things like, will your company become liable because, okay, this is $1 million transaction, they were going to buy a building, and bram, it fell through. All right? That's a serious thing. We have to weigh these things up in our organization, right? That's part of the risk, isn't it? That we're going to have to deal with. It became clear that it was obviously, they had 2 things that went wrong in their organization. They obviously, there was due diligence they should have asked us for that they didn't. The person that they was supposed to ask us for the information never asked us for the information, which we could have readily provided. But yet, they held us up.
So the client has decided to do some lawsuit, we could now transfer that to that bank.
Well,
Because they put you in that position.
here's the thing about that. We had one with a local institution here that held up funds for a client. All right? I suspect that what happened is, there again in that institution, they were provided with all the information, but they weren't reading the stuff that they were being provided with. Okay? They was being provided and filed and nobody looking at it to see if the transaction really was how we were saying it was. And it cost the client was losing something like $500 a day.
Wow.
You know, and we literally had to write them and say, look, if you guys can't resolve this, then the clients were right. They wanted to bring an action against the institution here because you're now costing the clients money. If there was an issue, you should have asked us. We could have provided you with the information. We provided you with the information in this case. You just didn't look at it. You see, so there has to be, you have to look at things and weigh them up. Okay? Remember, there are different ways I just want to go through because I want to start on risk. But remember, there are all sorts of things that can be banned. There are travel bans, all kind of bans. There are bans on goods and services. We talked about, certain types of industry because they could be used. So, you may not be able to import and export to this country, right? So if your client's saying they're sending money because they are paying for goods from that country, hello, you're in trouble, correct? If you don't understand what is in place, did they get an exception in some way? So it's important that you yourself have to understand your products and services. That becomes the underlying theme throughout this. So remember, UN sanctions are there for so many reasons. They have this 5 things that the UN tries to look at. Protection of civilians. They used it to get South Africa out of apartheid. They looked at things like Rhodesia, where they had the rebels came over and took over the government. There's so many things that, the UN tries to stop in their sanctions. We talked about OFAC sanctions. They designate how we designate individuals, companies that they may own, industries, organizations. Remember, organizations, even the world, the UN's arm that deals with helping to send aid was used in Afghanistan. Remember I gave you the example, they were shipping what they thought was needed goods, it was actually food and medical supplies, and the terrorists had infiltrated and put their guns and stuff under the food. Everybody could be used. It's just understanding and having a process and procedures in place to ensure that your company is doing what it needs to be. They talk about having systems that can track it, whether it's manual, how do you test, whether it's manual, or whether you may have a batch processing, an electronic system that helps you to pick it up. You may have a combination of those things, but each one you have to set policies and procedures so that everybody in your organization understands the policy, the process, how to escalate. Those are the things that you have to remember from the chapter. What else do I want to talk about? I know the stuff on the UK framework is kind of long, and it goes through so many things. A lot of these chapters are repetitive. Why? Because it's all trying to do the same thing. You have different ways of doing the same thing. Remember, U.S. banks, and a lot of banks can either block the transaction or freeze the account. Understand the situations in which they will block and freeze. I gave you some examples in the book. Read through the examples. They're real situations. Nobody wants to be a BNP. Okay? Note the offenses and penalties that come out of it. All of this brings us to one thing. How do you risk assess your organization? Under the Financial Transaction Reporting Act, I mentioned this last week. Everybody has to conduct a risk assessment of their organization. Okay? So now put it in law. So you'll find that your regulator says to you, please provide me with the policy that you have in place, the process that you used to risk assess your organization. Unit 8 deals specifically with risk management and specifically with AML CFT, risk assessment of your organization. Now remember what I said, some of us, we've not only had to do an enterprise risk, but we also had to do an AML CFT assessment of our organization. How do you do these things? Now, I will tell you, when I was doing my risk assessment, there was no guidance out there. Nothing to help me. Nobody knew how to do it. And everyone's like, okay, could somebody give me some guidance? The central bank actually did come up with some guidance notes on it. I don't know how helpful it is, but it goes back to some of the things that you're already doing, right? So everybody is doing this now, right? Everybody's risk rating, right? So in effect, you're doing the same thing within your organization for everything that's there that could be used in the process of AML CFT avoidance, right? So that's why it's important that you understand the product and service that you're offering. How can it be used? You have to document it. Understand how it could be used. This can go from insurance products to standard banking products to financial services products like trusts and companies and funds, mutual funds. All sorts of things can be used. It's just understanding how they can be used, documenting it. Is it the product and service that your organization uses? And what risks does it pose to your organization? Right? What are the risks? The risks are how they can be used, the fact that you could not maybe pick it up, right? So in your process, they have a nice chart in there. The only thing I don't like with the chart is most people who have this chart that's on page mine is 342. Depends on how you print it. So they have that chart there. On one side they have the likelihood of an event taking place and the amount of sustained damage to your firm. Most places have that in colors. Why? Because when you risk rate, most people risk rate high, medium, or low, correct? And they may assign numbers to high, medium, or low. So everybody has a risk assessment form on how they risk rate the client. So technically, you're risk rating your organization and products and services, right? So if I have, let's use a different color. So if I'm doing low, high, oh, sorry. Ah, I'm terrible at this. Okay, medium, right? I might give these numbers. I don't know, this might be 1 to 7. This may be 8 to, I don't know, 10, right? And this could be 11 to 20. Depends on how you, whatever the risks are you associate with that, right? So in all your organization, you're gonna look at everything that's in your organization. So let's look at one part. Let's take something. Let's use a product. So let's use a trust, right? Actually, let's use a company, because most people are maybe not be familiar with trust, but they're at least familiar with how a company works, correct? So you may have a company, you have shareholders, you have directors, for example, all right? Your company may act as the shareholder on behalf of someone. You may act as the director of the company, correct? What are the risks associated to your organization with offering that product? Those are two of the risks, right? The risk coming out of you, one, acting as the director, and two, acting as the shareholder, right? So you have to note, you have to say, these are my products, I offer 20 products. And I know how they could be used. And so I'm putting in, I'll put in a matrix. So remember now, when you do risk assessment, it isn't a check or answer, yes or no. What they want you to do is something like, and they don't actually say that here. They go in circles, I found. But most of us, we would say the risk. So we may say what the product is, or, right? We would say the risk. We would say how we are, what rating we're giving it. What are the controls that we have in place? And then maybe we would say and then we may have an action item here, right? And then we put this all in some kind of table report, right? So in this case, the product here is the company. Now what are all the risks associated with it? We said 2 of them. There may also be some employee risk, because our employee, who may be the point of contact for the client, could be used to help to ignore certain things. Since we're the director, the client said, oh, I need this to happen. And, I'll send certain things to you, to your account, if you don't report something, or maybe you overlook something. So there may be an employee risk. You talk about running your employees through OFA, correct? What's the likelihood that your employee could be used to put you in danger? That's all part of your risk, right? So once you have the product, that's part of the risk here. What's the likelihood of it? You're going to give it a rating. What's the control that you have in place? So one of the controls may be the fact that when you take on a new employee, you're going to make sure that certain things, the training is there. They become aware of your policies and procedures. You've done some searches, or you've done your due diligence on the employee, right? There's some kind of internal audit check that would also check what that employee is doing, all right? And that may be a department check that also then encompasses what the employee is doing, correct? So then you have, what is your internal audit process to check? What is the compliance process in that? All right, and then, so that would be, so part of your controls would be the policies and procedures you have in place, for example. All right, the fact that internal audit is checking it. Perhaps maybe that even you have evaluations of individuals every so many months, and when in part of that internal evaluation of that employee, you're looking at the stuff that the employee is doing. And you're giving it part of their rating, or things that, maybe you need to look at in terms of this employee. right? Action might mean something like, maybe you need to change your policies and procedures because the use of the product is changing, and therefore the risk that the product is being used for has changed again. This is a constant thing. You can't just do it once and hope for the best. It's constantly reviewing. Once you've done this for the first time, adding to it. If you change or add a product, you got to add that in there. Okay? That you may stop using a product. So then that comes off, but whatever replaced it or some other area that you went into, you have to look at the same things. That's in essence what that chapter is telling you. The unit goes all over the place, doesn't it? I don't know about y'all, but I was really kind of, I was like, is this ever going to come to an end? But I didn't feel that it kind of pulled it all together for you. In essence, this is what you need to do. So, it also is going to look at what risks is your organization prepared to take. What is that called? It's called risk appetite. What is your firm's risk appetite? That's going to be part of how you risk rate. What the risk to the organization, is it low or high, medium, whatever. Some institutions may be able to prepare to take a risk that's higher than a smaller institution. A larger institution's risk in certain areas is going to be different from a smaller institution. So one of the things that the larger institution may be prepared to do, because I'm not a BNP and I can't afford a fine of $9 billion. All right? So I'm not prepared to take the risk that they're prepared to do. They were prepared to have an internal policy that sought about how you could avoid the sanctions. They weren't concerned about getting caught, because the monies that they earned was worth it as far as they're concerned. So that's your risk appetite. Knowing the risk, and are you prepared, how much of that risk are you prepared to take if all goes wrong? That's the firm's risk appetite. And obviously your policies and procedures are based on your risk appetite. All right? So, if, as an attorney, if I was back in practice and my client account, how much of a risk am I prepared to take in using my account to put my client's funds in and moving that somewhere else? That becomes my risk appetite. Yeah? So they went through a lot to tell you that very simple thing. Now, if you're prepared to take the risk, then obviously your policies and procedures would be geared towards that. Maybe you don't look at as in-depth into certain things because you're prepared to take the risk. All right?
I find it's a little difficult in the sense that, for instance, for firms that really concentrate, law firms, that may really concentrate on mainly litigation and don't really do transactions and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
How do you create that barrier in terms of being affected by the regulations in that sense?
Well, part of it too is, okay, so you're in litigation. One, you have to set up your policies and procedures. One, two, how far are you ready, of your firm willing to go in terms of maybe assisting the client, in terms of how you putting together your, whether your arguments for that particular case, what lines are you not prepared to cross? That comes part of your risk, isn't it?
Yeah, but I'm saying in terms of the issue of anti-money laundering compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Does
yours may.
Does that risk arise to that extent?
Well, that's something you have to determine. What's the likelihood? It may be negligible for you, right? But there may still be. So, for example, my client, I'm representing the client and bringing an action against somebody for non-payment of goods and service. But I know for a fact, right, because of all the information I had to acquire in helping the client, that maybe the provision of that service that he's now trying to get the monies from went against one of the procedures, perhaps maybe the act, and am I prepared to close my eyes to that and nevertheless continue with it? Now, you may still want to continue with it, but you may still make a report. You see what I mean? Because all of that helps the FIU and other units within our police department to help to police this and stop things that are happening. Information gathering helps with everything, correct? And so maybe they may not take action, but they've gathered that piece of additional information on this person to help them in their investigations later on, correct? And so they may tell you, don't worry, go ahead. Fine. But they have now that piece of information to help them in building their case against that individual, correct? So, yeah, that's how you can look at it. I mean, it's hard when you're thinking about firms just doing litigation, right? But then you really have to sit and think outside the box. This is where you have to know how you can be used. All right? And it's hard. Yes.
Just along the point with the litigation, even where you have, like when you're just starting action, you get a retainer amount. A lot of times, I think, the transactional work, you're more concerned with the due diligence process. With litigation, you're just like, I have this matter, but you don't really ask. Sometimes you might not ask those necessary questions, like where do you get these funds? What's the source of the funds? And then you find sometimes people may start frivolous actions, right? And you take this large sum from them, and you don't know where it is. I mean, you don't know where it's come from, and you're processing bills, and then you release some funds back to them. I mean, I think about stuff like that.
That's exactly what they want you to think about,
right?
Because that's how you could be used. They're not really concerned if it's only a small amount,
Right.
We tend to think about if you're trying to use proceeds for different things, we think about big amounts. One of the things is structuring, one of the things smurfing, where you take small amounts to avoid certain things, and you've achieved what you wanted to achieve. You clean the funds, right? So once it hit your account and then you sending it back, it's cleaned, isn't it? Your client account. You've already been used, whether you intended to or not.
So how, is there any process in place where, like you mentioned, smurfing, and we tend to think about it when we go into financial institutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Law firms can be used like that also because, like she said, frivolous cases. So I could skip across 10 law firms in New Providence under 10,000. That's $100,000 a month.
Yeah.
So technology-wise, is there an infrastructure where, say for instance at Gomez and Gomez or whoever,
Mm-hmm.
is there some data bank where lawyers in that community can pull a name and say, there's their
But
pending?
see, now this is the problem. There
Because
isn't.
it's
There
jointed.
isn't. That's one of the problems.
It's jointed, so
Yes.
you can- So then, these guys could just go down.
Right, and law enforcement realizes and regulators realize that this is a problem. And obviously what they want to know is that you at least have been aware on your side that you haven't been used. So perhaps maybe you end up going to court and, and you're sitting there and then you hear this person's name again and you're thinking, wait a minute, hold on, what's going on? Or it may mean that perhaps maybe when you take the client on, you have to do a causeless search against your client. I mean, that might be something that may have to be done.
To see if it's a
You know?
track record of this person.
So that's a cost to your business that, you hadn't factored in before that maybe you have to do. All right, so that comes up as part of your risk assessment, and that might be a control that you have in place, correct? That you're going to check the cause list to see if this client is really one of these litigious persons who likes to bring frivolous actions. And why is that the case? Based on the information that they gave you where their source of funds is coming from and their source of wealth. You see what I'm saying? You see how you have to look at the picture. All right? It isn't always clear. And you have to look at how every department, every person in your organization could be used. Okay? And that's really what you're doing when you're risk assessing. One of the things I wanted to point out with that, so the table that they have there, usually when you go high, medium, or low, you're giving it a color. So low is probably going to be green. So that's the only thing I had with this, because this should really be a table that highlighted in color. Most times when you set up a table like this, where you have medium, you'll have the color. So most times people give medium as an orange, high as a red, all right? So let's look at another situation. So one of the things as an attorney that you may be doing, and most financial institutions look at, we're also looking at where's my client base coming from? If my client is from what I deem to be a high-risk jurisdiction, what am I doing to make sure I'm not being used? All right, so maybe I've said certain countries I'm going to do a little bit more due diligence on. That's part of my processes and procedures. And that's going to, one of the risks associated for that is the jurisdiction. So we're talking about geographical regions, right? Origins, where's the fund coming from? Is it coming from a country that, I have listed in my own process? So one of the processes you may have to do before you even start this is look at things like that first. And that's what they're telling you in this unit. You're going to have to look at, okay, what are the things that are associated with that product? So I may have a client that's coming from United Arab Emirates. Okay, I know there's a lot of rich people there, but I also know that they tend to help fund a lot of things, correct? So I have then set within my organization a list of high, medium, and low countries. So when I put together my risk rating of the client, I've already determined as part of my AML CFT assessment, risk assessment, that if you're from certain geographical areas, I'm adding that to my risk assessment. So my number, maybe I've added, if I'm doing you from 1 to 20, you automatically became a 3 before I've added other things to it. And that determines whether you become high, medium, or low. Does that make sense? All right. So all of these things, particularly in organizations where there is senior management and there's a board, they want to make sure that your board has approved all of these steps. You've set your policies and procedures based on these steps, these things that you've identified as risk areas and what you've attributed the risk to be. And part of your risk appetite will determine whether a country is high, medium, or low too, correct? So for me, in the trust industry that I'm in, I have a client who is from certain areas of the world, maybe Turkey, all right, or Yugoslavia. Well, it isn't called Yugoslavia anymore, but anyway, you know what I mean, right? Or they may be from Russia. Yeah, Russia's one of those places where, pardon?
Armenia.
Ireland? Yes, depends on what part of Ireland you're from. Remember, we talked about that. If you're from Southern Ireland, you may have already been moved up in my list, right? I mean, a Russian automatically, in terms of all those Russian states now that are now independent states, or countries, I should say, the sovereign states, I mean, they're probably all going to be on my list, right? So that's part of your process too. Remember, you have to risk rate all of those things before you can even do this. You have to think about those things. That's what it's really telling you when it talks to you about evaluating your risk and the treatment. What are you going to, how are you prepared to treat that? Is that something part of your risk appetite? Are you going to control it? It may have a low control because you don't really care about the risk. It's low risk to you. All right? So you have to prioritize all of these things and how are you going to risk mitigate it. They talk about different approaches in here. And they talk about avoiding silos. Okay. Wow, what does that mean? So they don't want you to look at things just like so we know what a silo is, right? So we're looking at like a tower, right? And everything falls within that. If it doesn't fall in there, then I don't look at how it relates to everything else. You can't, AML, CFT doesn't require, you can't do that. You have to look at the bigger picture. All right? They're interconnected relationships. So I can't just look at something in isolation is really how you can't look at things in silo, in isolation of other things. Because more than likely, you're gonna find you're in breach of one of your regulatory or legislative requirements, correct? So that's also part of your risk rating and works out in terms of how you're working out your methodology. Part of doing this risk assessment, you have to do a policy how you're gonna do the risk assessment. Joy. All right. So maybe you would, that's it.
Assessment first and then create the
Well,
policy.
actually, what I found, I did the risk assessment and then I did the policy. It was easy to do the policy once I understood what it was that the risks were, how was I going to tackle it. Because to start with the policy first, you're correct.
You never get there.
Yes. You can have a candy for that. That's an important point. All right? It's hard to look at the policy first. And maybe they would say that you're putting, the horse before the cart. But unfortunately, that's the reality. If you don't understand all those other things, it's hard to set up a policy, correct? So those are things that you have to look at. All right? And then a lot of this talks about, we talked about some of this too, changes that happen. There's always changes. There could be a change in your management that affects this, right? There could be a change in how products are looked at from a regulatory perspective, and so you have to incorporate that too into this whole table. Are you capturing all of the regulatory and legislative requirements when you're doing this risk assessment? Okay, so part of the risk might be one of the breaches of the legislative or regulatory requirements. How are you controlling it? Sanctions, let's look at sanctions. If you're doing sanctions, are you running it through? What's your policies and procedure for running it through different things to ensure that you know, and you're not gonna get a correspondent bank saying to you, we're not sending this, we're blocking this. And then you're put in a bad position. And then you lose the whole banking relationship because they say, you've had too many of these situations, so I'm sorry, I'm not gonna do business with you anymore. Right? So they want you to look at stuff like that. And that's why a lot of this is repetitive. Sometimes it may mean that you have to look at intermediaries, somebody who's assisting you, right? So some of us, we have business introducers, right? And they're the ones providing you with maybe the due diligence. What are you doing to make sure that that person really is adhering to regulatory requirements? And once you get that information, are you doing any independent checks? What are those independent checks? Is that part of your policy stating what they are? Is there weakness? Perhaps maybe there's some that are being overlooked. Are they being overlooked, and why? That's part of your action item, isn't it? To close the gap. All right? One of the things that came out of mine is the fact that despite we had a compliance manual in my organization and all sorts of policies and procedures, I did not have policies and I didn't have like a procedures manual for compliance. That's something I had to do. I can't assume that if I die tomorrow, everybody knows how the procedure is supposed to work for us monitoring accounts, for example. Right? I have to set that down somewhere so someone else coming in can not only jump into my position, but if I have a regulatory body coming in, they could see how I'm doing it. Right? So those are the how-tos that you need to make sure that you have, that's part of your control, isn't it? And the fact that I didn't have the control meant that I have an action item. I had the control, sorry, but I didn't actually have them written down. So I need to, part of my action was to do a procedures manual, correct?
So could you give a definition on the terminology control, just for me, kind of? Because I'm looking at one of the questions on the assignment, it talks about conduct and practices. Is it kind of similar, control and conduct, or the conduct would be more action?
It could be a combination. Your control is really going to be, what do you have in place to ensure that it doesn't happen?
Your policies?
Yes, your policies,
checks and
yes.
balances. Okay.
Right? How frequently is audit looking at
Okay.
that particular control?
So physically, control would be like your policies, procedures, examples would be maybe checklists, signing off, stuff like that.
Yeah, and are they adhering to it? No, so let me give you an example. I'm monitoring transactions, and I have a procedure in how I monitor transactions, and I'm monitoring transactions for all high-risk accounts. That's what I'm saying. Any transactions related to the high-risk account, I'm monitoring. If I have a combination of transactions that working out to $10,000 or more, I'm going to look at that. So I see 5 transactions in a month that end up, or maybe in a week, that ended up to $10,000. That's something I'm going to look at. All right? So part of my procedure is that I'm looking at not only transactions over a particular amount, high risk for high risk clients, but also part of my control would be right. Yes, am I looking into it, and does it justify what I know about the client, right? Now that might mean so I have to document that, right, somehow. All right, I have to. Unfortunately, the plane trees get cut down to do AML, CFT, policies and procedures, because you have to document yourself. Why you have to document yourself? Internal audit, or a bit of law firm, you're required that somebody's independent is coming in to check your processes, correct? And they come in and check your processes. Can they actually see what you're doing? And then not only can they see what you're doing, are you really doing it? If you say that to carry out a transaction, you have a checklist and all these things have to be checked off, and it has to be approved by the necessary people in your organization, and that isn't being done, who's picking that up? How do you know that now you've put it all in place but you're not carrying it out, or somebody is falling short of it? Okay? And so coming out of one of your action items might be that when you had the internal audit, they found a problem with your control. So your action item is, how do you mitigate against the fact that you didn't do something? Correct?
Yeah. So you find that confidentiality is out of the window, right? Pretty much.
Pretty much they say now. Even with, it's interesting, we have things like the EU's GDPR, which is General Data Protection Regs, right? They talk about you can't hold client information for so long. You can't be sending client information this way unless you've gotten the client's permission. When you got that permission, you can't use complicated language. It has to be simple language that the client can understand. All these things, right? And so the question in today's world, how much is there of confidentiality? People would say there's still some, right? But obviously there's so many ways that, unfortunately, you may have to give up that information, whether the client gives you that approval or not, because statute says you have to do it, correct?
Yeah, and then files are being inspected, so.
Well, they're not supposed to come in and inspect you and then go to somebody else and blab all different information. What they're supposed to do is to put it in a report, provide you a report, and provide it to the regulator, correct? So technically, then they also still have some requirements for confidentiality. They can't go and say, "I came to your firm," and you won't believe who they have as a client, right? They have to, when they do their report of you, they indicate to you this may be the risk of this client. And if they think it's a risk, obviously in that report it's going to be reflected, because you have to provide the report to your regulator. And the regulator, then looking over that report, says, okay, I'm not saying that because the client was high risk you couldn't have the client. What I'm saying is, what did you put in place to ensure that you know how you're being used by the client, and to prevent you being used in a way that you shouldn't be used? All right? Isn't that all part of risk rating and your risk appetite and all of this risk assessment? It isn't saying you can't take on a client. It's saying understand the risk. What are controls you're putting in place to mitigate that risk? And are you making sure that you're constantly reviewing that to make sure you're always on top of it, and looking at changes that may have occurred in your environment, whether that's a regulatory environment, whether that's a legislative requirement, whether that's just changes in how products are being used generally. That's why it's always important to keep abreast of FATF and other places that put out methodologies and how and typologies of how products are being used, because it changes. Yes, ma'am.
Does it fair to say or presume that the highest risk client that you may have in your organization then dictates your policy?
No.
Because I'm wondering, say for instance, if I have Cindy here, who's a client,
Mm-hmm.
and she's risk
High.
1.
Okay.
Low risk.
She's
And-
low.
And I have Mr. Gomez here, who's at a 19.
Mm-hmm.
From a standpoint of treating both clients or both clients being a part of the same organization, do you have specific policy for that particular client, which is outside of what
To
you
some
do?
extent, you would, because it's like you have a PEP policy, right? In your PEP policy, you may, all your PEPs are high risk. And if they're high risk, you're looking at them more frequently. So you're not maybe reviewing them every year, but you're a low risk person, you're gonna maybe every 2-3 years, right? But somebody who's high risk that you know is subject to all kinds of things like corruption and bribe, all these things, right?
So pretty much, it's not that they have different policy, but the manner in which you execute that policy, frequency. For instance, her frequency may be twice a year, biannually. Gomez may be every month. But it still it comes under that control of monitoring.
Yes.
But it's just that for this particular individual, we need to monitor him.
Right, so whilst it may not be the sole reason why you have the policy, it's part of the consideration. That's why I say, it isn't that, they're trying to say you cannot have a high risk. What they're saying is, if you have a high risk client, how far are you prepared, what are you doing to mitigate the risk that, you've determined is the situation? So whilst I may have PEPs, I may have somebody who's a football player, right, from the NFL. That is, would I necessarily risk them high rate? I have a thing called persons who are, they have influence. So they become part of my high risk. Why? Because, the mere fact that they're stars, the wealth that they have, they can influence things that the low risk client, the average Joe on the street can't necessarily influence, right? And so that becomes a risk. I mean, we saw through the FIFA scandal how things can be used, right? So everybody knows the FIFA. FIFA was the football, or we call it soccer, association, and how they would ensure that certain countries, the actual international, it's like holding the Olympics of football, right? Which country is being held in, and all the things that was being done behind the scenes to make sure that country A got it as opposed to country B, and whose pockets was being lined. All right? That was big money. All right? That was big money. A lot of people's pockets got lined. But remember, I told you too that everybody set up different things now. So we have things like the unexplained wealth orders. Remember, I told you that comes out of our Proceeds of Crime Act 2018. No, we're not the only jurisdiction that has it. The UK's already started implementing theirs. All right? So if you're a sanitation worker, but you could send me $500,000. That's called, yes, particularly gas. That's called unexplained wealth, is it?
What about when we have entering into politics and they disclose their network, and then 5 years later, the network has exorbitantly increased, and based on your generating income or potential income producing whatever, you're like a millionaire. How do you explain that?
Well, that's called unexplained wealth, right? That should have put your firm on notice that all of a sudden, because they have a public disclosure that they have to make in terms of their finances, right?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, you could be like Trump, who never wants to disclose his tax returns, which he was required to do, correct? I don't know how he's able to get away with that personally, but it's interesting. All right? But yes. These are things you have, we look at, the countries that we tend to look at with that, where you get a lot of that, is out of Africa, all right? You get it out of the Far East too, Russia. I mean, we have the whole big scandals now with Russia, right? There's some serious banks got caught, correct? There again, what was the problem? Greed is a serious thing, right? And because of greed, we didn't make sure that we had proper policies and procedures in place, and even if we did, we didn't adhere to them because at the end of the bottom line was more important. So then if you go to jail, you're prepared to take the risk to go to jail, right? And I always tell you all, I don't go on the speeding bus. Yes?
Is there any foolproof system against money laundering?
No. If that was the case, life would be grand. We wouldn't need compliance officers, right?
It can be,
Yeah.
because once you have persons who are willing to participate in that process, you would
And
always.
understand, human nature is
In this
such
country,
that,
you get a bunch
any
of-
country, right, human nature is such that if people will find a way to help you to get through them. And that might not necessarily mean greed. It may mean that they threaten your livelihood, maybe they threaten your family to get you to cooperate, right? And so if we had a foolproof procedure, then none of us would have been here. We could have just put this in some policies and procedures and that would have been it, right? But unfortunately, life isn't like that. This is a constantly changing environment. I can tell you from the time that I left practice to go into a financial institution in the late 1990s, much has changed. All right? What I was required to do back then and what I'm required to do now is totally different. The things that I have to consider is different. Risk assessment, who was risk assessing back then?
Nobody.
No one. But you're required to do it. And look at the section in the Financial Transaction Reporting Act that says that you have to risk assess. You know, the legislation comes out, nobody reads it, and then they get caught.
And then they get mad when you.
And then they get
find out.
mad, yeah. For example, the Financial Transaction Reporting Act, when it came out, talked about giving financial institutions, which means non-designated financial institutions, professions in business, a year to come up to scratch on the identification of their customer and facility holders, right? A year. That time is almost up,
Almost up.
right? So when the Compliance Commission comes knocking on your door through the Securities Commission is going to do the inspection for them, what you could say, they could fine you.
Well,
They will, yes. And do they find you? Yes, we've had that fine. All right? We had the central bank is one of my regulators. I have more than one regulator, and we had a situation where, and it was interesting. For some reason, we prepared a report, and it never got to the central bank, and we got fined. Luckily, it wasn't a huge fine, but we got fined. I mean, it was nice that when they sent me the little notice to tell me that I now have an administrative penalty. And I was being fined on a daily basis.
So the solution is not on technology?
Some of it is. A lot of the stuff through the regulators now is through a portal where you submit information. Some of it is required that you're going to have to actually send it in. Okay, because we're not as technically advanced as we would like to be, and that has to do with funding. So, you know, it's interesting enough, my gentleman here from the FIU will tell you that the requirements under the new act puts a lot of obligations on the FIU, and are they being funded? Some are saying yes. The government is saying they're funding them. They're going to provide them with this awesome technology and additional resources. But the question is, are they really getting it? You know, one of the concerns we always have, you know, I always tell people, this is why you network, right? So I get to know my regulators, because I need to be able to call out somebody at the FIU and say, look here, if this person isn't there, I need to speak to this person or whoever else is there. And I have that kind of relationship. So, I'm sure Mr. Colley doesn't mind me calling his name. I say, look here, Mr. Colley, this is my situation. I need some direction, all right? And I have that ability to call him and talk about it. Part of the job of a compliance officer is building those relationships. My regulators at the central bank, I know who, I mean, they keep changing the person who's supposed to be looking, my administrator, right? But I build that kind of relationship with them. Look here, this is the problem. all right? My server went down, this is happening, I know I'm supposed to have procedures in place to back this up, but we could not have foreseen this, I'm gonna be a little late. Or she may call me up, or he may call me up and say, okay, I noticed that you haven't sent your report in that you need to send in. That's corporate governance, I have to do that on an annual basis, right? I have to give a corporate governance certification every year within a certain period of time after my financial audit, correct? If I don't, I'm gonna get fined.
What is that?
Pardon? Corporate governance.
Governance, sorry, what is that again?
So, it's a whole list of things, but basically, the regulator wants to know that the persons who oversee my organization, so we note from Enron, why you cannot, and people like Volkswagen, that you can't say that you're at the top and you didn't know what was happening at the bottom. Okay, and so you have to have every level of management buy-in. That's what corporate governance is. So everything has to be reported up to the board. No longer can somebody who's up there say that they didn't know. You're required to know. You're sitting there, you're in charge of this. Why don't you know? So, for example, I mean, you should have gone through this already. You'll find that everybody has some kind of committees to deal with things, and they're board committees, so that the information flows up to the board. The board isn't going to necessarily be involved in the day-to-day operation of your organization, but you have to be able, they have to be able to say that they were made aware. Not only that they were made aware, they did something about it as part of the control. They put some policy and procedure in place to correct the problem, or to resolve the problem, or to prevent the problem, mitigate it. You know, the days are gone when you say you don't know. They hold everybody responsible. All right? We've had persons who got dealt with basic things, scams, right? Okay, let's talk about some of the things that we know from the Bahamas. We know that there was the Nigel Bows who were being used by their clients to put monies into the financial institution. He went to federal prison, correct? They used the extradition laws to get him to the U.S. He spent time, right? We have people like Martin Tremblay, who was a broker-dealer who was in the Bahamas and breaching all kind of laws, and they waited for him to get off of a flight that wasn't supposed to stop in New York, and they took him away. All right? We have the Caledonians. We have the Michael Hepburn, who was an accountant. He was absolved of his charges, but unfortunately his flight ended up where it wasn't supposed to, in the U.S. Right? And when it landed, they were there, right, to take him away. All right? My cousin got caught, Sydney. He didn't understand things like Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes, right? How are you being used in these things? That's why it's important to have the controls. How can you be used? How can your product be used? Okay, and that's part of this, your risk assessment. All right? Part of that would be training. So you've identified all of these risks, and part of one of the things that you may put here, this may not just be products, this may be just maybe an item action where you put whatever it is that you consider. Training might be not necessarily a product, but maybe that's an internal process, right? It falls under that heading on the far left-hand side. Training, how am I training? Part of my training is for everybody to be able to understand things like this product could be used in a Ponzi scheme. Everybody knows what a Ponzi scheme, right? Okay. Pardon? Unfortunately, you know, we know of a Ponzi scheme that was being done here, and people were falling for it, right?
It was several of them.
The Fruit Express, yes. We won't say what the fruit was, but everybody knows what the fruit was, right?
Yeah.
Fruit Express? All right.
Pineapple.
I'm trying to be political.
All right? But there again, it was working on.
She was charged, right?
Yeah, it's worked on greed, isn't it?
Yes.
And particularly in times when things are hard, the economy isn't doing as well. People may do things that they ordinarily wouldn't do, right? And the public isn't aware of a lot of things, unfortunately.
Come on now. Regardless, I'm not seeing.
It's not a, I don't think that a person is simple man's tax.
The thing is, once you fall for a Ponzi scheme, as far as I'm concerned, you're a thief.
A lot of people don't use common sense. That does not seem logically thinking.
If you have a financial issue, right? So let's look at these products. I'm helping you, one of the most recent things is the travel thing. You know, if you join, you help to, you're selling, packages, you know, your cruises and hotels, and you get all these deals, and you invite other people in. What is that? That's a pyramid,
The way to look at it.
right? Most people don't even realize it is that. Okay? And it happens all the time. Okay? They do it through products too. Amway was one of those that was used all the time, right? And yeah, they still use an Amway, and then they have things like what's the other one? Is it Melatonin, something. This product where I can't remember what it's called. It starts with M, but you know, you're selling the product and you're getting people to come in, and as you bring more people in, you're getting a bigger percentage of the sales.
That's doing now with the Bitcoin, you know.
Yeah, they're doing it with big. Everything, you know, can be used. I mean, this is why the regulators, law enforcement realizes that we're going to have to put in more policies and procedures and legislation in place for cryptocurrencies and things, and you know, like that, right? I mean, one of the things to remember, the Financial Transaction Reporting Act, in the definition nowadays, I believe it's asset, not currency, but you'll have to check it because I can't remember right now. But it speaks about virtual assets, right? That could be clawed by, because we know that it could be used. Who's checking to see where that money came from, and you buying that electronic form of money? All right. It's like let's look at Target. Target should be doing a risk assessment. Why should Target be doing a risk assessment? What is it that they sell that could be something that they really need to look at the risk to their organization? Prepaid cards, right?
Walgreens.
Yes, but I only use Target as one of the examples. But yes, Walgreens, Walmart does it all the time, right?
I think they say you have to use your social security, in some instances.
Some instances, and in different countries, you know, I could do a whole lot of those. Listen, terrorists, they realized, and I think it was the bombings in France, that what they did was they went and they loaded those American Express ones, right? Prepaid. How do you know? I mean, they could, once you withdraw the funds, nobody's asking you to produce identification and where did the money come from, right? When they upload that, they're not asking you for source of funds. They might ask you for identification, but what is that? Other than you may be able to track it to that person, but that's about it, isn't it? And if I use the false ID, you still ain't gonna track it to me. All right? And so technically, you see how this goes through every industry. Everybody is susceptible. And that's why we have those non-designated professions and businesses. All right? This is why we have to risk assess. This is why that's one of the products that they should be looking at, right? Prepaid cards. I do it all the time. I fill one up for my nephews because they happen to live in the U.S. And I leave it for them, and they go and spend their money. But nobody asks me where I got the money. You know, obviously some places now within certain jurisdiction, they put into legislation. If you're, just like the $10,000, if you're putting monies over a certain amount, then the institution that's selling it has to have policies and procedures in place to make sure that they do certain things. So that when law enforcement comes in to track that now, you can provide certain information. Yeah? Some, like you said, security, they require your Social Security or national identity number. I mean, Most people don't realize that our NIB is the equivalent of our Social Security or National Identity Number, right? For places like South American countries, they have more national identity cards. Most people see the Swiss ones, right? These are used, and they can track. You know, we have those little chips on there. We wonder what those chips are for. Well, they download all your information from there. All right, and this is why you can't just leave your wallet around and other things like that.
But they have so many fake ones.
Of course they do. I mean, one of the problems that we've had, let's look at our passport office, for example. Okay, we went electronic, but notice they came out again with a different electronic. Why? Because when the FBI investigated us, right? It was on the news, everybody knows, right? It was clear that certain things were happening in our immigration department, which is where the passport office falls, right? So then the concern was the fact that we had gone to the electronic passport, but some of the information that maybe was in those original electronic passport wasn't really correct. And so that's why the second time around, you were providing all that information again, correct?
But the thing about this, just tell us what you want, and don't have us come in 6 times. That's all you want.
Well, they would say that if you go to their website, they have a list of everything, but of course that's not necessarily what happens when you get there. All right? And unfortunately, ours is a jurisdiction where, you know, let's think about it. Your birth certificate could have the wrong name for you. It does. It can have the wrong.
Yeah, they make a mistake. You have to pay for an
I have to pay
My boss had to get two.
Well, needless to say, thank you very much, but it keeps us attorneys in business, okay? But, I mean, this is the reality, right? How the difficulty is when they came in, and not only the the FBI investigation, but when FATF came in and they looked at the nation as a whole, and they looked at the passport office, and they said, well, how do you know for sure? Well, we're getting the birth certificate. But then half of the birth certificates come with an affidavit to say that they put the wrong name on the document to start with. And bear in mind, your passport, your birth certificate isn't going to be changed. You're going to have to record that affidavit and always use it together, because they're not going to change it. That's the reality.
The one good thing I like about it, because I used to work in money transfers, and I was aware of a client that bought his passport. So I was so curious to see if he would ever
get
an e-passport. He never did. However, he had a valid voter's card.
So we know, there again, controls. We had a serious problem with controls, right? So remember now, all of this had to do with risk assessing. They have all the steps, and then 2, you're going to look at whether you're doing it from bottom. How are you looking at your approach? Is it top down, bottom up? Most of us go from bottom up, or a combination of the 2, because you need to make sure that you covered everything. So if you go from top down, you may miss stuff. You want to go from bottom up, because the flow, the information, the escalation, how is everything working in your organization? Are you going to miss stuff, right? So they refer you to a number of cases, not under this chapter, but like I said, I would encourage you to read the central bank has put out a guidance on AML CFT risk assessment. Read through it. It helps with this unit. Oh yeah, I was supposed to look at your questions. Hey. Right. What impact has the U.S. Patriot Act had on conduct and practices of international firms? Well.
Hold on, wait. What question are you on?
Is that the one? This is the one, right? This is the one you're. That's the first one.
This was you go back to ask.
Okay.
Conduct cannot be controlled, right? That's the one. Is that?
Let's go. Give us all the answers.
That's what she was asking. Go right down.
I can't give you all the answers.
No, but that's what she wanted
But
to know. And
I think obviously in Unit 6 they speak about at page 261. It's the start where they talk about the U.S. Patriot Act, right? The significant points there are the changes that was made after 9/11, which are actually noted at 262. Right? So really what they, conduct and practice. Okay. So, trying to see if they actually help you with this at all.
Mm-mm, they ain't help.
No.
No, go ahead,
Just a
help.
little bit. Just a little, just tell us.
So, conduct is going to be, what are you actually doing? All right? Sorry, let me put it like this. Not only what are you actually doing, but how can certain things be used? All right? So we're looking at things like, what should be your red flags, really? How can somebody, because that product is being used. So first identify the product. What are your requirements for finding out things about the person if they're, so what are your AML requirements? That's really what they really want to know. And then practices is what does the Patriot Act require? Does it align with international obligations? Does it? I think it does to some extent. Interesting enough, the U.S. isn't caught up with the rest of the world, even though they are trying to do so now in terms of the due diligence that we have on file. All right, so one of the things you need to understand, so understand what it is that you're required under the Patriot Act. All right? So part of that is you need to understand the beneficial owners, correct?
Right. I know I get that part.
They're right here for you though. Look, see, U.S. banks must take reasonable steps to identify the beneficial owners of accounts, right? Identify foreign persons whose funds move through payable and corresponding bank accounts. You must sever corresponding banking relationships with shell banks. Look at the extraterritorial of the act. All right? How do they align with best practices that's set by international organization? And a lot of, I mean, they align, don't they? We know that internationally you still have, with corresponding banking, they don't allow you to deal with shell banks. They do, you have to do your due diligence. You have to have certain policies and procedures in place where you talk about sanctions. That's where they're bringing all this stuff in. How are you dealing with things like PEPs? Right? That's why they're asking you about PEPs later on. The clue's always there. Okay? Obviously terrorist financing, so I mentioned that there because that's one of the reasons why the Patriot Act came into effect. Did it not? They extended it, it was kind of in effect too, but they really widened the scope of it after 9/11, right? 6 or 7 weeks later. So they have 10 marks. So I would split conduct and practices and give 5 points to each. So make sure you have 5 points that specifically deal with conduct and 5 points to deal with practice. And you'll get the 10 points. Right? Yeah, it's 10 points, 10 marks. Remember, you always want to make sure you get as much as the marks as possible. And marks usually relate to whatever they have in there. So it says evaluate the difficulties in defining who is a PEP. Right? What are the difficulties? Anybody?
Well, definition, differences to
Definition does differ to an extent, but that's where you bring in international standards as relates to pets, right? So not only do they include the individual themselves, but includes persons who are connected or associated with them. And the difficulty is that you may not be able to truly understand who are the persons who are connected to them or the businesses that are connected to them, correct? That's one of the clues, right? And then some things is countries. It may be difficult for you to determine if the person is a pet. Remember now that some definitions may not include persons who are in quasi-government organizations, right? Okay, give me a quasi-government organization in the Bahamas.
Central Bank.
Central Bank is a government body, but water and sewage, DPL. All right? Their boards particularly are very politically appointed, aren't they not? All right, finding out if somebody's actually a PEP is very difficult in some jurisdictions. Even the tools that we use may not be, if there's a change in government, for example, then you may not be aware right away that the person has become a PEP. The difficulty is somebody that you take on today may become a PEP later, right? That's one of the difficulties you have. What are you doing to make sure that you're constantly checking somebody to ensure that you may not have to re-risk rate them from low to high because they're now the mayor of some area. That's possible, right? So that's some clues for you. Make sure you get.
That's like 5.
Yes, so figure out the rest.
Do most institutions put the onus on a client to?
No. To determine if you're a PEP?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, not the onus for them to determine, but do most institutions request the client to identify if they're a PEP?
They may
based
have,
on their own
yeah,
knowledge?
they may, part of their
Due diligence with
due diligence process, they may
customer.
ask certain questions to see if you're a PEP. Most of the time, the client may not tell you they're a PEP. You can find out when you do your intelligence database searches, right? Or if you didn't know that something has changed, when you decide to send out that wire, correct? You're gonna find out because they might be blocked. Okay? Examine the nature of a risk-based approach to AML CFT and how to apply it. So there again, that's unit 8, but in all the other units, they always refer back to risk. And they talk about the risk that you should look at. No problem. So one of the things is risk appetite. That's referred to in quite a lot of the units, right? So you're gonna have to list some of the things that you're gonna look at in terms of your the nature of your risk-based approach, right? So there again. Look at your products and services. How are you risking things geographically by origin of funds? How are you doing it? What are your regulatory requirements in that regard? Okay. Okay? Evaluate the significance of the recent work of the FATF and analyze how jurisdictions have been encouraged to implement the principles and recommendations of FATF. So what's the significance of FATF? They risk rate your country as being what? Non-compliant, deficient, and guess what the rest of the world then determines for every other reason why you then drop in their rating too. So that might mean the IMF rates you somehow differently. The EU, all sorts of things will rate you differently. So even Standards and Poor, those type of ratings may drop for your jurisdiction because of your FATF recommendation, right? And so the work of, so they really want you to speak to FATF and the recommendations. So FATF looks at things like terrorist financing. It looks at countering financing of terrorism, proliferation, AML processes and procedures. What do you got? Making sure that you have certain things in place.
That's a reason for it. So should we just go back to everything I just? bring it to
The recent,
17, 18.
the recent work has been more with CFT, and proliferation, correct? That's the most recent stuff.
Yeah,
And that's the units that you're dealing with. See how it ties right back in? If you're not sure, you could just go on the website and just, you see the most recent stuff, you could tell what it is. Okay? Using no more than 1,000 words to illustrate the main offenses of money laundering with reference to a jurisdiction of your choice. Well, obviously, it's always easier to do your own.
And so, difficulty is getting examples of cases. The most
But they're asking you to illustrate the main offenses. Now, it might be, yes, difficult to get examples of, to support it in terms of cases where you can actually tie it in. You know?
they're out there, because you see
But-
the record where they happen.
According to the AG, there's 41, eh?
No, he said 40 prosecuted with 19 convictions.
And I still haven't seen the list. You're never gonna find the 19, trust me. Everybody's been trying to find that.
Yeah, I've been soliciting, the AG office, the FIU, municipality staff, and you can't get it.
I think you're going to have to speak to things like we've had cases where they sought to deal with bribery and corruption, where they sought to deal with, then, well, we know one got overturned already, right?
Yeah, that
There's still a
was-
few others out there that are being dealt with.
There is one on the Supreme Court site that was appealed.
Yes.
And then you have a lot of pending.
A lot of it is pending.
Cases with
Right.
trial dates of February and so. you
Well,
don't
Frank
know.
Smith was a no case to answer.
Yeah.
They dismissed it,
Wasn't it
right?
on-
We
on
still,
one of them also?
Dorset, we still have the Gibson case out there, right?
Dorset on pending and
No, that's been dealt with.
he was convicted?
No.
Oh,
So Frank.
so that's irrelevant.
No, but they give you
No,
examples of,
illustrate.
you only have to illustrate, you don't have to
Okay.
say that they actually, was able to convict, right?
Oh, okay, so we could also use Frank's.
Yeah, you can use Frank's
Okay.
case.
Directly matter.
Directly matter, yes.
What about, the CLB lady, Shanika Gibbs, because she was not charged with money laundering, and I thought that was kind of a clear case of self-laundering.
But did she have to be charged with money laundering, given the schedule offenses? It's easier to charge you with fraud, isn't it?
It is. So is that the reason why you're going to charge her with what is obviously easier to stick?
Yes,
Exactly.
I'm going to charge you what I know I can convict them on.
Exactly.
Correct.
Because,
So-
but
so
remember,
why-
they could use it because it's a predicate offense.
Right.
You know, it all could
That's-
tie in. But what they use is their strategy to get you to go to jail or
So,
to fine
part of
you.
our Proceeds of Crime Act is what amounts to a predicate offense,
But
right? The
thing-
schedule offenses are predicate offenses, right?
What if she,
You know what the schedule, hold on, you know what the schedule offenses are?
the,
Right away, Vina. Who's the list?
They're at the back of the act. They're at the back of the act. So they look at things like offenses under the Gaming Act, Bribery Act, the Penal Code, yes, Anti-Terrorism Act. There's a whole bunch of them there.
Okay.
Even environmental, there's an environmental act where, you know, they get cruise ships, Royal Caribbean and Carnival were charged with dumping. So they went to certain islands in the Bahamas and all they saw was the trash that was being dumped from these cruise ships.
so I wanted, like, this up a lawyer to say to me, and I can assume that they didn't bring those charges to Shanika Gibbs money laundering because he couldn't stick.
Yes, but remember now, as a prosecutor, I'm always gonna charge you with what I know I can convict of.
So, but.
It's harder to get the money laundering offense because I have to show more things, but I can charge you.
Could you not still add it in, and then it just doesn't stick? Along with
Okay,
other-
she may have been, but that offense wasn't really the one that they went on, okay? And more than likely, they may have even removed it.
Why not? Because, I mean, I never did understand what money laundering is. Why
You added to it? Could it be because that's also the past? Meaning, when I say that, because of our troubles now with the FATF, etc., they will now be including money laundering basically on
Everything.
everything now.
They will more than likely.
They will more than
Because
likely
we're
now.
all, we're told that, okay,
Not since
Listen.
all our black.
in the past, they said that, look, if I can charge you with the predicate offense, and don't charge you with money laundering, then I'm gonna charge you with the predicate offense because I know I can,
Get
I
you
can
on it.
convict you.
Right.
All right? Now, because we have CFATF looking at us, more than likely, they're gonna charge you with a money laundering offense. But what they have to prove for a money laundering offense, the burden of proof is higher, or maybe it requires a little bit more, and so if I can, it's easy to prove that it was outright fraud, okay?
I saw
Technically,
recently-
the funds are already legitimate because she took it from a legitimate source. So now you have, it's your burden
Yeah, but it's
now
a
to
proceed of
prove.
crime. You've stolen it.
Yeah, it
And so now
is.
because you've stolen it and you are now putting it in, you are laundering it.
But hold on.
But I understand that, but still you have the basis. It was legitimate to begin
But
with.
hold on, the difficulty is, like you said, are they the proceeds of crime, because once the fraud is committed, did she transfer it somewhere else?
Right.
Okay, but then the question is, can they then trace that enough to be able to substantiate a case when I can charge you with fraud and get you and get a jury to
I get you
convict?
fine,
But the
okay.
thing about it is that
That's
based on the article I read, they had substantive evidence that this woman was directly involved with taking the funds from COE, arranging the transfer and spreading within about 3 banks locally
Yeah.
into her name
So
account.
she was structuring as well?
Yes.
Wow.
Layering it.
Wow.
Yeah, but again, it was before
It was
the pressure for us to make sure.
Still a good,
No, yeah.
to refer to.
You could.
You can refer.
She really got convicted.
Right, the thing is, when you don't have to-
Because even now, when you don't declare with the custom stuff, they are even using that as money laundering.
Yes, because, wait now,
Because you
hold on.
haven't declared that
Yes,
10,000 or
under
above
the-
10,000,
Okay.
that's money
When you
laundering.
get the Anti-Terrorism Act, the legislation that deals with, what's it called, the Traveler Something Act, right? It's in the front of that, and that's where if you, in essence, if US Custom catches you with funds, right, then the local authorities here can charge you. Okay?
So they shouldn't have taken any money.
In addition to them taking the money.
So,
Yeah.
back to the question.
Okay?
Yeah.
If we're doing the illustration, we just need to illustrate it.
So you're gonna illustrate
Can we
the,
illustrate, we have to illustrate.
The main
real
offenses.
life situations.
I think you have to give some kind of example.
Okay, but they don't have to be convicted.
No,
No.
just that it
Okay.
Yeah,
You wanna
just have to show
You wanna
that they,
illustrate.
They were
do they have to
indicted
be
for something.
prosecuted? Or
Well,
they have to-
No, but once you've been
In most
charged,
cases,
you
those
go
cases
through a
that you're gonna
case.
use, they've been
Will be
prosecuted. Now, the
prosecuted.
fact that they were convicted or not
Yeah.
is another
A
question.
charge or indictment doesn't mean you're
Okay.
guilty.
But at least they can.
Remember, hey, hold on, everybody's presumed innocent until proven guilty.
No, so we don't not worried about it, but then they do say that, what is the, what's the penalty though?
Oh, go ahead. Let's
So we
continue.
just listen to penalty based on what the law says there, and not so much based on what
Happened in the case?
happened in the
Well,
case.
if you have a case, then you can
Exactly,
give that.
right, if
Yeah.
it
Says you
And if you do, you should
establish how money
email that to
laundering
us.
offenses can be committed. The legislation that is applicable to establish the offense of money laundering and the
And-
potential penalties for the commission.
So potential means,
So the-
they could possibly.
But what are your penalties under the
The
act?
penalties are just.
5 to 7 years or
Yeah.
up to
And the
whatever.
fines,
So
Yes.
the fines are
And on conviction.
And they want you to give examples of that. So in the Bahamas, under section blah, 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 the penalty is,
for
For this,
concealing.
but for this is this and for that is that,
Mhm.
and for
Or
that is
both.
that, or both.
Yeah.
all
But
right?
then I'm saying it's not even based on the illustration.
You see, I would even go so far as to say, with our change in our new act, the fines went up.
The fines went up.
And they went up considerably, so we went from,
But my
so we
question
went
is,
from 10 years to 20,
no,
for
but
example.
my question is, right, okay, if we use the Bahamas, when we use the Bahamas underneath the post,
The poke,
Poker
right?
to
in,
the
different international standards, there are 3 main offenses, if you understand what I mean, but under
Let me ask you, the 3 main offenses
Offenses
are
are-
covered in,
Right,
are-
poker.
right?
Right.
And if you have to, and I always tend to do this, in your unit, they refer you to the UK offenses, right?
Right.
That you can show mirror,
Right.
and I would do the comparison.
Comparison, okay, good.
Right?
3 main offenses.
Well, there's 3 main offenses that you could actually pick out. That's not the only offenses, but you could, you know what I mean?
Internationally,
Concealment, agreement, and.
Yes.
on by international standards, there's 3.
Attempting to conceal, arrange
And possession.
possession.
So the other 2, like what, tipping off and failure to disclose, what would you call them?
Well, I think they don't really, they're not looking at that as much as they're looking at the other offenses.
And then for their fines,
Okay, and the fines and the offenses that are attracted to it, because they're going to be the same. You could refer to tipping off, because most countries tipping off is an offense,
Okay.
but are they technically the main offense? No, but I mean, you can always reference it. Yeah? Okay,
Yeah.
sounds like you all got this.
Next.
Analyze the nature and
And
extent.
given the amount of words that you have, I mean, you could reference examples, but you don't have to go into details of the examples, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Personally.
True.
I thought we employed 3,000.
It can run up quick, so, yeah, okay. I would like how my young friends done here. I would take a piece of paper and put down the main things that I'm gonna put for each question. Put things that I'm gonna use to support it. So when you actually start to write, it's easier to go ahead, right? And then if you have your word count on, you'll know how far over you are, or how short you are. In terms of, you gotta pad that up a bit, okay? Yes, ma'am.
In terms of when you're giving your professional fees with the,
Right, I have to look at my notes.
money laundering offenses, examples.
Remember now, they're not looking more, okay, so they're looking more at the offenses as opposed to really cases where there's been convictions. Okay? That's what they're really looking at, and how you can say that those offenses relate to similar offenses elsewhere. Okay? That's really what they want from you.
Now,
And the offenses and the penalties that go with it.
they are looking for the 3 main offenses, which we have already know. But the cases that I would have seen out there in the web pertaining to our jurisdiction, either with or without conviction, it just gives a broad charge of money laundering, but not specific, saying concealment or whatever. So you could just, based on what the law says concealment is, and your knowledge of the charge or the case, then you would say this is money laundering, and in this particular case, concealment, where, whatever. And
Okay, I think you need to first look at the offenses, right? You already talked about the things that you need to cover, right? Concealing, attempting to conceal, assisting with it, all the rest of this, right? That's really what they want to know, the offenses. Then you have to tie in things like what becomes main offenses, because it's a predicate offense because it's attached to the schedule, right? Now, tax evasion technically is an offense here, but we know that if you breach the VAT Act, then that falls under predicate offense, right? Now, we don't have income tax,
I'm following your train of thought.
okay? That's an offense, and you have to somehow, you're gonna have to tie in that, what they tend to do to create to tie in other offenses to those main offense. We have, in most cases, in most countries, they have schedule offenses. In our case, we have a schedule offense, right? And the schedule offense is long, and it can always be added to, and sometimes it's added to the act itself coming into being. So, for example, when they had the whole issue about cash for gold and all the rest of that, when they brought in the legislation, they hadn't updated the schedule offense. So what they did is they put it in that act to say it forms part of the schedule to the Proceeds of Crime Act. You see how they did it? And then later when they updated the schedule, then you'd see it. But there was a gap in time, but it became part of the schedule offense.
Right. So
Okay.
just to recap.
All right, so you're gonna have to give some examples. So you could give examples by tying in the predicate offenses too, right? And then you give examples of this, okay, I think I gave you ours as 15 through 18 or something like that, and the UK's are, in terms of the, no, I lied. I can't remember right now, but obviously if you look at the new act, in terms of what the offenses are, and I think I stand to be correct, somewhere around 14, 15, right? You can see the equivalent in the UK, correct? Because they actually give it to you in the unit. So you want to be able to show a little comparison there, so that you could say that you understand, and this is how it is. Most of other jurisdictions have mimicked it, correct? Okay. Analyze the nature and extent of the powers of the U.S.
OFAC.
Which is OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, regime that has given rise to substantial fines imposed. Okay, so they gave you a whole bunch of examples in the book. So we know that, one, everything has to clear to, most people are doing money in US dollars. It's going to have to clear to the UK and the US. And so OFAC puts out certain requirements that the clearing banks, corresponding banks are going to have to deal with. And so that shows the extraterritorial arm of it. We talked about things like BNP and those places. I think they had Standard Chartered was one of the other examples they gave you. They gave you quite a few examples of how OFAC's extraterritorial arm is used. That's what they're looking at, how that comes into effect. What are the penalties? They give you a whole bunch of examples, right? So the penalties that come with breaches, right? And they'd ask you to, and the likely impact that they would have on the conduct of your organization. So we already talked about that too, right? Yeah, you're gonna have to have policies and procedures in place to make sure that you're you're adhering to sanctions that are put out by OFAC. You have to keep reviewing your clients. You have to keep up with OFAC changes. I mean, so many things here. That's 20 marks. Now you can get that easy.
Okay.
So I think the thing to remember is, even though it's a U.S. domestic regulatory body, it's extraterritorial. And remember, I talked about the whole thing about you dealing in U.S. dollars. So unfortunately, they will get you through penalties and fines. They could block your account, because a lot of times when you're setting up a correspondent bank, your organization also has a bank account with that correspondent, right? So they just, even if you don't have a presence, they're gonna freeze your accounts there. You're not gonna have access to this, right? So those are things that you have to look at in explaining the likely impact of the fines. Also, it affects your business. You got reputational risk. Financial, all kind of things can come out of it. Okay? I'm sure you guys will get through this easy. Always be mindful of where most of the marks are going to be. So look at, your marks are going to be in your last 3 questions. So that's where you have to concentrate most of your effort. Your other ones, they're only looking for like brief things. They want you to almost like bullet point, this, and this. You're going to get your 10 points. Once you have them, move on. Because these are the ones that you're going to have to beef up. The last 3. Right? Thank you. Who's paper? Sure.